Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum students. How are you? I hope you all are well. I am your English teacher. Students, we are on chapter number 8, Emily Leaves Home. This is fourth and last session of this chapter. In the previous sessions, we read about David's stay at Steerforth's home. When David went to Steerforth's place, Mrs. Steerforth and Miss Dartle were very happy to see him. Miss Dartle asked to David about the reason of Steerforth's changed behavior. David replied he doesn't know about it. During the outing, David noticed that Steerforth was acting as a good companion of Miss Dartle, but Miss Dartle behaved strangely. After spending the wonderful time with Steerforth, David said, I will go early morning before you wake up. Steerforth wanted to David to stay longer. Steerforth said to David, if we separated for any reason, think of me kindly. Then David replied he will always love him. Next morning, David left before Steerforth woke up. Then David went to Yarmouth to meet Peggotty's. Mr. Peggotty was very pleased to see him. It was a rainy night. David met Mr. Peggotty, Miss Peggotty, and Mrs. Gummidge. Miss Peggotty was sitting on her chair as she had never got up from it. Mr. Peggotty put the candle near the window and told the reason to David about this custom. Emily was not at home. Mr. Peggotty and David were talking about Emily. When Ham came, he was alone. Emily was not with him. Mr. Peggotty asked him about Emily. He made a sign with his head as if to say that Emily was outside. He had seen to David. He requested to him to come outside. When David was coming with him, he noticed Ham was looking worried. He asked to Ham, why are you so worried? Ham told Emily has gone. He said to David, how will he tell all this to Mr. Peggotty? Mr. Peggotty had already heard their conversation. He said to David to read the letter which Emily had written for Ham. She wrote to him, you always loved me more than I deserved, but I am going and I won't come back until he marries me. She wrote, forget me and forget that we were going to be married. Imagine that I had died when I was a child. Love another girl who will take care of you and uncle. Mr. Peggotty was very shocked, but he took care of himself and asked the name of the person to whom Emily had gone. David had an idea who the person was. When Ham told the name, he was shocked. Ham said, Mr. David, it's not your fault, but David was feeling guilty. At last, Mr. Peggotty decided that he will go to find Emily and bring her back. He requested to David to go to London with him. Okay, students, let's start the chapter to know what happened when Mr. Peggotty and David went to London. Students, as usual, first I'll read a paragraph, then I'll explain it. And before explaining, I'll tell you meaning of difficult words. Let's begin. Mr. Peggotty visits Mrs. Steerforth. When we reached London, we looked for some rooms where Mr. Peggotty could sleep. Luckily, we found some only 2 streets away from mine. He told me that he wanted first to see Mrs. Steerforth. I wrote to her that night. I told her as politely as I could what Steerforth had done, and I explained my share in the crime. I said that we would come at 2 o'clock in the afternoon to see her. Students, look for means search or hunting. Explain means make an idea clear to someone by describing it in more detail or revealing relevant facts. This paragraph states that
When David and Mr. Peggotty reached to London, first David searched a room for Mr. Peggotty where he could sleep. Luckily, they found a room near David's room. Mr. Peggotty told to David that first he wanted to meet Mrs. Steerforth. He was very curious to know about Emily. David replied that we will go to meet her at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. David had already informed her politely by a letter about what Steerforth had done. He honestly explained his share in this crime. Let's move on. At the arranged time, we arrived at the door. Mrs. Steerforth was at home. Rosa Dartle quietly moved from another part of the room and stood behind her chair. I saw immediately that Mrs. Steerforth had heard from Steerforth about what he had done. Students, arrange means to make plans or to put in order. This paragraph states that at the fixed time Mr. Peggotty and David reached at Mrs. Steerforth's home. She was present at her home. Miss Dartle was also there, but she was standing behind her chair. David came to know that Mrs. Steerforth had already heard from her son Steerforth about what he had done. Let's move on. Please read this, Mrs. Steerforth, said Mr. Peggotty, holding out Emily's letter. That's my girl's writing. She read it in a proud, calm way, gave it back to him. I am quite certain that they can never be married, and never will be, she said. But if there is anything else I can do, are you offering me money for my child who is ruined? Students, calm means not showing or feeling nervousness, anger, or other strong emotions. Certain means it is used to emphasize the speaker's belief that what is said is true. Ruin means the physical destruction of something. This paragraph states that Mr. Peggotty said to Mrs. Steerforth to read the letter that Emily had written. He more added, "It's my girl's writing." She took a letter from him and read it very proudly and calmly. Then she gave it back to him. After reading a letter, she said, "I am sure they will never be married." She more added, "I can do anything else for you?" Mr. Peggotty said, "You are offering me money for my child who is ruined by your son." Let's move on.
She changed now in a moment and became angry. To please my son has been my only purpose in life, she said. Now he has run away suddenly with a worthless girl and left me. Do you think that this does not wound me? Rosa Dartle tried to comfort her, but she would not be comforted. Students, worthless means having no real value or use. Purpose means a reason for which something is done or created. Comfort means free from pain or trouble. This paragraph states that when Mr. Peggotty said to Mrs. Steerforth that you are offering me money to cover up your son's deed, she became angry and said to Mr. Peggotty, "The only purpose of my life is to please my son." She more added, "Now he has run away with a worthless girl." She spoke with great contempt about Emily. She said it is very painful for her that her son, to whom she loves a lot, left her for an ordinary girl. Rosa Dartle tried to relax her, but she would not be relaxed. Let's move on. Then we went away. Mr. Peggotty walked slowly and thoughtfully down the hill. He told me he meant to set out on his journey that night. I asked him where he meant to go. He only answered, "I am going, sir. I am going to find my girl." Students, this paragraph states that when David and Mr. Peggotty left Steerforth's house, Mr. Peggotty was walking slowly. He was deep in thought. He told to David he will set out on his journey. David asked him where he intended to go. He only answered, "I am going. I am going to find my little Emily." Okay, students, this chapter has completed. Now I'll explain today's lecture in Urdu. स्टूडेंट्स, जब डेविड और स्टीव फोर्थ लंदन पहुंचे तो सबसे पहले डेविड ने मिस्टर पैगटी के लिए रूम तलाश किया जहां वो आराम कर सकें, और लकीली वो रूम उन्हें डेविड के रूम से ही 2 गली के फासले पर मिल गया। मिस्टर पैगटी ने कहा कि मैं पहले मिसेस स्टीव फोर्थ से मिलना चाहूँगा। डेविड ने उन्हें बताया कि वो मिसेस स्टीव फोर्थ को लेटर के थ्रू सब कुछ इन्फॉर्म कर चुका है जो भी स्टीव फोर्थ ने किया, और उसने ये भी लिख दिया है कि खुद डेविड का इस क्राइम में कितना हिस्सा था। फिर डेविड ने उन्हें बताया कि हम 2 बजे मिसेस स्टीव फोर्थ से मिलने चलेंगे। मुकर्ररा वक्त पर वो दोनों यानी डेविड और मिस्टर पैगटी मिसेस स्टीव फोर्थ के घर पहुंच गए। मिसेस स्टीव फोर्थ घर पर ही थीं। रोज़ा डार्टल भी वहीं थी और वो चेयर के पीछे खड़ी हुई थी। मिसेस स्टीव फोर्थ ने बताया कि स्टीव फोर्थ उन्हें इन्फॉर्म कर चुका है कि उसने क्या किया है। मिस्टर पैगटी ने एमिली का लेटर निकाल कर मिसेस स्टीव फोर्थ को दिया और कहा कि ये मेरी एमिली की राइटिंग है। उन्होंने वो लेटर बहुत फ़ख्र से और बहुत पुरसुकून अंदाज में पढ़ा और फिर वापस मिस्टर पैगटी को दे दिया और कहा कि मैं ये यकीन से कह सकती हूँ कि वो कभी शादी नहीं कर सकते। इसके अलावा मैं आपके लिए क्या कर सकती हूँ? मिस्टर पैगटी ने डिसहार्ट होकर कहा कि आप मुझे मनी ऑफ़र कर रही हैं मेरी बच्ची के लिए जो कि बर्बाद हो चुकी है आपके बेटे की वजह से। मिसेस स्टीव फोर्थ ये सुनकर फ़ौरन गुस्से में आ गईं। उन्होंने कहा कि मेरी ज़िंदगी का वाहिद मकसद मेरे बेटे की खुशी है। अब वो दूर जा चुका है, वो भी एक मामूली सी लड़की के लिए। उसने मुझे छोड़ दिया। आपके ख़्याल में क्या ये सब मुझे तकलीफ़ नहीं देता? रोज़ा डार्टल वहाँ पर मौजूद थी और वो मिसेस स्टीव फोर्थ को पुरसुकून करने की कोशिश कर रही थी, मगर वो बहुत अफसरदा और गुस्से में थी। इसके बाद डेविड और मिस्टर पैगटी वहाँ से चले गए। मिस्टर पैगटी आहिस्ता आहिस्ता कुछ सोचते हुए चल रहे थे। उन्होंने डेविड को बताया कि वो रात को ही सफ़र पर रवाना हो जाएंगे। डेविड ने पूछा कि आपका कहाँ जाने का इरादा है? ही रिप्लाइड, मैं जा रहा हूँ अपनी एमिली को ढूंढने। Okay, students, now move towards exercises of this chapter. Make sentences of the following words. Mention, conversation, wildly, wild beast, express. Students, here 5 words are given. I'll tell you meaning of these words and you have to make sentences by your own self. First word is mention. It means refer to something briefly and without going into detail. Urdu meaning zikr, taskara ya hawala. Second word is conversation. It means to talk, especially an informal one between 2 or more people, in which news and ideas are exchanged. उर्दू मीनिंग गुफ्तगू करना, तबादला ख्याल करना, गपशप या बातें करना। Wildly, it means in a way that lacks discipline or restraint. उर्दू मीनिंग बेदर्दी या बेताबी से। Wild beast, it means animal not tamed. उर्दू मीनिंग जंगली दरिंदा, वहशी जानवर या वो जानवर जो कि पले हुए नहीं होते। Express means convey a thought or feelings in words or by gesture and conduct. उर्दू मीनिंग इजहार करना या ज़ाहिर करना। Students, this chapter has completed. Read it thoroughly. I hope all of you have done the previous work. Now first make index, then do word sentences in your English literature copy. Students, learn dictation list number 1 from your final term dictation list. Inshallah, we will start new chapter in the next session. Thank you. Till then, take care of yourself and your family. Allah Hafiz.